The fluorescent lights flicker in the underground chamber. It's 2:30 in the morning, March 14th, 1944, deep beneath the Harz Mountains of central Germany, inside a facility that doesn't officially exist. Dr. Karl Friedrich Weber stands alone in Section B7 of the Mittelbau-Dora complex, in his hand a precision torque wrench. Before him, rows upon rows of V-2 rockets, Hitler's vengeance weapons, gleaming under harsh industrial lighting. Each one capable of carrying a 1-ton warhead at 4 times the speed of sound directly into the heart of London. Weber's fingers tremble, not from fear, from exhaustion. He's been awake for 37 hours straight. But something is wrong with these rockets. Terribly wrong. In the past 6 weeks, 32% of all V-2 missiles launched toward Allied targets have failed catastrophically. Some explode seconds after launch, and others veer wildly off a course, plunging harmlessly into the North Sea. A handful simply refuse to ignite at all. SS investigators are tearing through production records, interrogating workers, looking for saboteurs among the 30,000 concentration camp prisoners who assembled these weapons under brutal conditions. They haven't looked at the engineers yet. They haven't suspected that one of Hitler's own trusted scientists has been systematically ensuring these rockets fail. Weber glances at the documents in his leather satchel. Calculations that appear flawless, specifications that seem perfect, but buried within the technical precision are microscopic modifications. A fuel injector valve opening 1.3 millimeters too wide, a gyroscope calibration shifted by 0.04 degrees, changes so subtle they pass every inspection, changes designed to fail at 30,000 feet. Outside, footsteps echo in the stone corridor. Weber's heart hammers against his ribs. Did they discover what he's done? It won't be a trial. It won't even be a camp. The Gestapo has a special basement in Berlin for traitors who wear the uniform of the Reich. He checks his watch. 2:34 a.m. In 6 hours, another transport of rockets will roll out toward the launch sites in Holland and France. In 6 hours, another batch of Hitler's terror weapons will be loaded with coordinates for civilian neighborhoods in London, Antwerp, and Paris. And in 6 hours, if Karl Friedrich Weber has done his calculations correctly, most of them won't reach their targets. This is the story you've never heard. The engineer who saved countless lives by deliberately failing. The Nazi scientist who chose to become a saboteur from within the heart of Hitler's most devastating weapons program, and the impossible choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. To understand how one engineer could defy the most powerful tyranny in modern history, we need to step back to where it all began. September 8th, 1944. Chiswick, London, 6:43 in the evening. Mrs. Ada Harrison was preparing dinner when the world ended. No air raid siren, no warning at all. Just a massive explosion that obliterated her home and 15 others, leaving a crater 30 feet deep. The British government initially claimed it was a gas main leak, but Londoners knew better. They'd heard the rumors about Hitler's new terror weapon. The V-2 rocket had arrived. Unlike the V-1 flying bombs, those buzzing drones that at least gave you warning when their engines cut out, the V-2 was silent, supersonic, unstoppable. It struck at speeds exceeding 3,600 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound itself. By the time you heard the explosion, you were either already gone or you'd survived. Over the next 7 months, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets would rain down on London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. Nearly 10,000 civilians would perish. Thousands more would be horribly injured. This was Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe, his vengeance weapon, and it represented the most technologically advanced military system of World War II. The V-2 stood 46 feet tall, weighed 27,000 pounds fully fueled. Its liquid oxygen and ethanol engine generated 56,000 pounds of thrust, capable of reaching an altitude of 55 miles before plummeting back to Earth with its 1-ton explosive warhead. To put that in perspective, the V-2 routinely entered the edge of space. This wasn't just a weapon. It was the world's first operational ballistic missile, the grandfather of every rocket that would later reach the moon, the direct ancestor of modern ICBMs. And it was being mass-produced in the most unlikely place imaginable, Mittelbau-Dora, a concentration camp hidden inside a mountain. The facility was carved into the Kohnstein Massif near Nordhausen in central Germany. 2 parallel tunnels, each over a mile long, connected by 46 cross galleries, 25 million square feet of underground factory space, invisible to Allied bombers. Here, in conditions that defy human comprehension, 60,000 slave laborers worked around the clock. Prisoners from Buchenwald, Dora Mittelbau, and satellite camps, Jews, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, resistance fighters from across occupied Europe. Whoa, They worked in perpetual artificial light. Many slept on the floor of the tunnels themselves. Dust from blasting operations filled their lungs. Malnutrition, disease, and brutal treatment from capo overseers and SS guards eliminated 20,000 of them before the war ended. The V2 production line at Mittelbau-Dora was Nazi Germany's darkest marriage of cutting-edge technology and absolute horror. But among the German engineers and scientists who oversaw this operation, not everyone believed in Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. Carl Friedrich Weber arrived at Peenemünde in October 1938. He was 29 years old, with a doctorate in aerospace engineering from the Technical University of Berlin. He'd grown up in a modest household in Stuttgart, where his father managed a textile factory. Young Carl showed early promise in mathematics and physics. By age 12, he was designing glider prototypes. By 16, he'd published his first academic paper on aerodynamics in a regional engineering journal. He was political, or so he told himself. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Weber kept his head down and focused on his studies. He watched Jewish professors dismissed from the university, witnessed brown shirts beating students in the streets, heard the whispers about neighbors who disappeared in the night. But science, he reasoned, was neutral. Engineering transcended politics. He could pursue his passion for rocketry without endorsing the regime, or so he convinced himself. Peenemünde was paradise for a rocket engineer. The facility sat on a remote Baltic island with unlimited funding from the German military. The man in charge was Dr. Werner von Braun, just 26 years old but already a visionary genius. Von Braun dreamed not of weapons, but of space exploration, of mankind reaching the stars. The military didn't care about von Braun's dreams. They wanted missiles. Weber worked on fuel systems, specifically the intricate network of valves, pumps, and injectors that fed liquid oxygen and ethanol into the V2's combustion chamber at precisely calibrated rates, get the mixture wrong by even a small percentage, and the rocket would either fail to ignite or explode catastrophically on launch pad. It was exacting work, brilliant work, the kind of engineering challenge that kept Weber at his desk until 2 a.m, running calculations by hand, testing prototypes in the laboratory. He tried not to think about what these rockets would eventually do. But then came November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Weber was in Berlin that week for a technical conference. He watched from his hotel window as SA thugs smashed the windows of Jewish-owned shops. Synagogues burned, people dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets, while police stood by and did nothing. He returned to Peenemünde, shaken, started asking questions. Careful question. One of his colleagues, Dr. Hermann Obert's former assistant, pulled him aside after a design meeting. "Be careful what you say, Carl. There are informants everywhere. The Gestapo has files on all of us. But surely we're scientists. Surely they need us. They need us compliant. They need us productive. They don't need us thinking." Weber learned to keep his thoughts to himself. He focused on the work. By 1942, his fuel delivery system had become standard across all V2 production units. His name appeared on classified patents. He received commendations from the Reich Ministry of Armament. He was, by every measure, a success. And then in August 1943, everything changed. The Royal Air Force bombed Peenemünde. Operation Hydra, they called it. 600 aircraft dropping 1,800 tons of explosives. The dormitories where engineers and technicians lived took direct hits. 735 people perished that night, including many of Weber's colleagues. Production moved underground to Mittelbau-Dora. Weber's first day at the Mittelwerk facility, he descended into the mountain and saw hell. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, barely human, assembling the most advanced machines on Earth. SS guards with clubs and dogs, the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste and death, the sound of coughing that never stopped, lungs destroyed by stone dust from the tunneling operation. He watched a prisoner collapse from exhaustion while carrying a rocket component. A guard beat the man until he stopped moving, then ordered 2 other prisoners to drag the body away. Production continued without pause. Weber went to the surface and vomited behind a storage building. That night, alone in his quarters in the nearby town of Nordhausen, Carl Friedrich Weber made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't stop the V2 program. He couldn't free the prisoners. He couldn't end the war or overthrow Hitler. But he could make the rockets. The next morning, Weber returned to the facility with a leather notebook tucked inside his coat. He began documenting every aspect of the production process, not to improve it, to sabotage it. But here's what made Weber's plan both brilliant and terrifying. He couldn't simply wreck the rockets. that would be detected immediately. Components were inspected multiple times. Test firings occurred regularly. Any obvious defect would be traced back to its source. Instead, Weber needed to introduce failures that would only manifest after launch, problems that would seem random, malfunctions that could be blamed on the inherent complexity of rocket technology, or the poor quality of slave labor. And he spent 3 months studying failure modes, analyzing past misfires, running calculations in secret. The Phi-2's guidance system used a gyroscope to maintain orientation during flight. Weber realized that if he altered the calibration specifications by less than 1/10 of a degree, the rocket would gradually drift off course. Not immediately, not in a way that ground tests would detect, but at altitude, that tiny error would compound, sending the missile miles from its intended target. Fuel flow rates presented another opportunity. The mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol had to be precise, 75% alcohol, 25% water, with liquid oxygen oxidizer at exactly minus 297 degrees Fahrenheit. Weber modified the injector valve specifications by a margin so small it fell within acceptable tolerances on the production floor. But at full thrust, those margins would cause combustion irregularities. Some rockets would burn their fuel too quickly and fall short. Others would develop oscillations in the combustion chamber, leading to structural failure at altitude. He modified turbopump specification, adjusted electrical relay timings by milliseconds, changed the alloy mix in certain welds, making them more susceptible to stress fractures under extreme conditions. Every modification was documented in his official engineering reports as an optimization or improved efficiency measure. The language was technical, dry, bureaucratic. No one questioned it. He was Dr. Carl Friedrich Weber, the fuel systems expert, implementing refinements based on his extensive experience. And one by one, his modified rockets began rolling off the production line. January 1944, the first batch of rockets incorporating Weber's modifications launched toward London from sites in occupied Holland. 42 missiles fired, 27 struck their targets, 15 failed. That's a 36% failure rate, far too high. Weber's heart sank when he saw the reports, not because the rockets had failed, and that was the goal, but because such a high failure rate would trigger investigations. He'd been too aggressive, too obvious. The SS Weapons Office dispatched inspection teams to Mittelbau-Dora. They interrogated production supervisors, examined assembly procedures, and began looking for saboteurs among the slave laborers. Weber watched in horror as prisoners were hanged for sabotage, men whose only crime was being too weak or too slow or simply being in the wrong place when the SS needed scapegoats. He had to be more careful, more subtle. For the next 3 months, Weber refined his approach. He introduced failures to only 20% of production units, still significant, but within the range that could be explained by the complexity of the technology and the inadequate training of forced labor. He varied the failure modes. Some rockets would explode on launch, others would fail mid-flight. Still others would successfully reach altitude but land miles from their targets, the guidance system failures rendering them ineffective. He kept meticulous notes, hidden in the false bottom of his leather satchel, each modification coded in a personal shorthand that would mean nothing to anyone else. But the psychological toll was crushing. Every day, Weber walked past the prisoners assembling rockets in the tunnels, starving men with hollow eyes who knew they were building instruments of terror but had no choice. Some made eye contact. Most kept their heads down, knowing that showing any emotion could mean a beating or worse. There were whispers among the engineers that some prisoners were deliberately sabotaging components when they could, urinating into fuel tanks, leaving out bolts, scratching electrical wires, tiny acts of resistance that risked immediate execution if discovered. Weber wanted to help them, to acknowledge their courage, but any communication was impossible. He was a Nazi engineer. They were prisoners. The gulf between them was absolute. And yet, in a strange way, they were allies. On March 3rd, 1944, Weber encountered a prisoner in the Section B7 late at night. The man was perhaps 40 years old, though starvation and hard labor had aged him beyond recognition. He wore the red triangle of a political prisoner. They were alone in the corridor. The man looked directly at Weber just for a moment. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and continued walking. Weber never learned his name, never knew what he'd done to end up in the camps. But that brief moment of recognition changed something fundamental. He wasn't alone in this, couldn't be alone. If prisoners were resisting with acts of sabotage despite the near certainty of being caught and executed, how could Weber, who faced far less risk, do any less? He doubled down on his mission. April 6, 1944, 2:15 in the afternoon. Weber is summoned to the office of SS Sturmbannführer Hans Kemmler. the man responsible for V2 production. Kammler is a cold, efficient technocrat who sees human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded. His office sits above the mountain facility, with windows overlooking the town of Nordhausen. Weber's stomach churns as he climbs the stairs. Have they discovered something? Traced one of the failures back to his modifications? He enters the office. Kammler doesn't look up from the papers on his desk. Dr. Weber. Sit. Weber sits back straight, hands folded in his lap to keep them from shaking. Kammler finally looks up. His face is unreadable. We have a problem. Sir, failure rates, they remain unacceptably high. 23% of units in the last production cycle. The Führer is furious. Weber's mind races. The complexity of the system. I don't want excuses, Doctor. I want solutions. Kammler pushes a folder across the desk. You will review every aspect of the fuel delivery system, every component, every specification. You will identify the source of these failures and eliminate them. You have 2 weeks. Weber opens the folder. Inside are production reports, failure analyses, and a list of prisoners who've been executed for suspected sabotage. 23 names. Men ended because of failures that Weber himself engineered. His throat constricts. I'll begin immediately, Sturmbannführer. See that you do. Dismissed. Weber leaves the office, folder clutched to his chest. Back in his quarters, he sits at his desk and stares at the names Schmidt, Novak, Levine, Rousseau, each one a person. Each one gone because of him. He tells himself they were doomed anyway, that the SS was looking for scapegoats and would have found them regardless, that his sabotage is saving lives. British and Belgian lives, yes, but lives nonetheless. But the names haunt him. That night, unable to sleep, Weber makes a decision. If he's going to continue, if he's going to honor these men's unintentional sacrifice, he needs to be more effective. He pulls out his hidden notes and begins planning his masterwork. Not a simple modification, a cascading failure built into an entire production run. The next day, he submits a proposal to Kammler's office, a comprehensive redesign of the fuel turbopump assembly, claiming it will increase reliability by optimizing flow dynamics. The technical language is dense, impenetrable to non-specialists. The proposal is approved within 48 hours. Over the following 3 weeks, Weber oversees the implementation of his new design across 400 V2 units. On the surface, the modifications appear to enhance performance. Fuel flow is smoother. Test data looks excellent. But Weber has built in a time bomb. Literally, the turbopump bearings now use a slightly different alloy. Under normal operation, they perform perfectly, but after approximately 90 seconds of flight time, right as the rocket reaches maximum altitude and begins its descent toward the target, the bearings will begin to degrade from thermal stress. Not catastrophically. The rocket won't explode. It will simply lose thrust consistency. The trajectory will become erratic. And instead of plunging down onto London or Antwerp with precision, the V2 will fall harmlessly into the countryside or the sea. It's perfect, deniable, explainable as a materials quality issue, perhaps related to wartime shortages of proper alloys. The first batch of modified rockets ships out in early May. Weber waits, checks the reports obsessively. May 15th, the initial results arrive. Of 43 rockets launched, 38 experience guidance failures at altitude. 3 land in unpopulated areas. 2 fall into the channel. The remainder strike far from their intended targets, causing minimal damage. Weber sits alone in his room and weeps, not from joy, from the awful weight of what he's done and what he's failed to do. Lives saved, lives still lost. The impossible mathematics of resistance under tyranny. But his celebration, if you can call it that, is short-lived. On May 18th, another summons to Kammler's office. This time, he's not alone. 2 Gestapo officers flank the desk, their faces blank, professional. Kammler looks furious. Dr. Weber, sit. Weber sits. Every instinct screams to run, but there's nowhere to go. Kammler slides a document across the desk. It's a metallurgical analysis of the turbopump bearings. Explain this. Weber's mouth goes dry. He forces himself to look at the report. The analysis shows the bearing composition is outside specified parameters. The difference is minute, but it's there. I don't understand, Sturmbannführer. Those bearings should meet all specifications. The supplier delivered exactly what was ordered based on your revised specification. Kammler's voice is ice. Specifications that, according to this analysis, are insufficient for the thermal stresses of operational flight. Weber's mind races. Deny everything. Blame a subordinate. Claim it was an honest engineering error. Before he can respond, Kammler continues. However, that single word hangs in the air. However, Kammler repeats, I have reviewed your personnel file. Dr. Weber, Your loyalty record is impeccable. Your contributions to the program have been significant. And according to Dr. von Braun himself, you are one of our most capable engineers. Von Braun? The name crashes into Weber's consciousness. Von Braun knows, or suspects, but he's providing cover. Therefore, Kammler says, his tone softening fractionally, I am choosing to interpret this as an engineering error, a miscalculation under the pressures of accelerated production. Such things happen. One of the Gestapo officers starts to speak, but Kammler silences him with a gesture. You will correct this error immediately. New specifications will be issued. Production will continue. And you will personally oversee quality control for the next 6 months. Dismissed. Weber stands on shaking legs. Thank you, Sturmbannführer. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. Weber leaves the office, barely able to breathe. He's survived. But the message is clear. He's being watched. One more error, and not even von Braun's protection will save him. Back in his quarters, Weber burns his hidden notes. Everything. All the documentation of his sabotage, reduced to ash in his small heating stove. He can't continue. Not this way. The risk is too great. But as he watches the papers burn, a new resolve hardens in his chest. They're watching him now. They'll scrutinize his every modification, his every specification. Fine. Then he'll use that scrutiny against them. June through November 1944. Weber becomes the model Nazi engineer. Every specification is perfect. Every modification is cleared by multiple reviewers. Every test result is flawless. The V2 rockets rolling off the Mittelbau-Dora production line are now the most reliable they've ever been. Except where Weber has learned a crucial lesson. Sometimes the most effective sabotage is perfect compliance. The V2 program is consuming resources that Germany desperately needs. Each rocket requires 30 tons of potatoes to produce the ethanol fuel. Thousands of hours of skilled labor, rare metals and components that could be used for conventional weapons. And for all their technological sophistication, V2 rockets are militarily ineffective. They can't be aimed with precision. They can't target military installations or infrastructure with any consistency. They're terror weapons, capable only of random destruction against civilian areas. In August, Weber volunteers for a special project, improving production efficiency. He creates detailed reports showing how the V2 program could be streamlined, made more cost-effective. His recommendations are implemented. What the SS doesn't realize is that Weber's efficiency improvements are actually inefficiencies, carefully disguised. He's redirecting resources to unnecessary testing procedures, creating redundant quality control checks that slow production without appearing to do so, building bureaucracy into a program that desperately needs speed. By October 1944, V2 production has slowed to 70% of projected output, not because of obvious sabotage, but because of Weber's perfectly logical, perfectly defensible optimization protocol. And unlike his earlier modifications, this sabotage can't be traced back to him. He's just doing his job exceptionally well. But Weber pays a personal price. Every day he walks through the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora, past the prisoners who are still being worked to exhaustion, past the bodies being carried out, past the suffering he cannot stop. He saves some lives by slowing rocket production. But thousands more perish in the camps before Allied forces arrive in April 1945. On April 11, 1945, units of the United States 3rd Armored Division liberate Mittelbau-Dora. Weber is arrested along with other engineers and administrators. He's interrogated by American intelligence officers looking for information about German rocket technology. He tells them everything: the specifications, the production method, the location of hidden documents, and prototype design. But he never tells them about the sabotage, never mentions the failures he engineered or the production delays he orchestrated, partly because he's afraid they won't believe him, partly because he's afraid they will, and he'll have to confront exactly how much more he could have done. The Americans are interested in his technical knowledge, not his conscience. By June, Weber has been recruited into Operation Paperclip, the secret program to bring German scientists to the United States. He refuses. Unlike von Braun and many others, Weber doesn't want to continue building rockets. He returns to Stuttgart, to the Germany he barely recognized, devastated by war and defeat. He never practices engineering again. He opens a small bookshop in 1948, marries a school teacher named Elizabeth in 1951. They have 2 daughters. He lives quietly, almost invisibly, for the next 40 years. His neighbors know him as a kind man who reads extensively, who volunteers at the local library, who never talks about the war. Only once does he break his silence. In 1983, a British historian researching the V2 program contacts Weber. The historian has found anomalies in production records, patterns of failures that seem too consistent to be random. Over 3 meetings in Weber's bookshop, the old engineer finally tells his story. "I want you to understand," Weber says, his hands shaking as he pours tea. "I was not a hero. I was complicit. I worked for them. I benefited from their system. I designed weapons that ended lives." The historian starts to speak, but Weber continues. "The prisoners in those camps, the ones who risked immediate execution for tiny acts of sabotage, they were the heroes. I was just a coward who found a safer way to resist. And even then, I didn't do enough, could never do enough." "But you saved lives," the historian says. "Your sabotage prevented rockets from hitting their targets. And how many prisoners were executed because the SS blamed them for my failures? 23 that I know of, probably more." Weber sets down his teacup, his eyes distant. "I'm not telling you this for redemption. There is no redemption. I'm telling you because people need to understand how these things happen, how ordinary engineers and scientists become part of monstrous systems, how easy it is to tell yourself that you're just doing your job, just following orders, just focusing on the technical problems while ignoring the moral one." The historian publishes his findings in an academic journal in 1985. It creates minor controversy. Some historians question whether the failure patterns Weber described actually constitute intentional sabotage. Others argue that Weber is retroactively claiming resistance he never actually practiced. The debate remains unresolved. Carl Friedrich Weber passes away in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall falls. His obituary in the local newspaper describes him as a beloved member of the community and devoted father and grandfather. It doesn't mention the war, doesn't mention the rockets or the camps or the choices that haunted him for 44 years. But among his possessions, his daughters find a locked box. Inside, photographs of Mittelbau-Dora, production records, technical specifications covered in Weber's handwritten notes, and a letter, never sent, addressed to no one in particular. "To whoever finds this," it begins. "This is what I did. This is what I failed to do. Remember it, so that perhaps you will do better." The full truth about Carl Friedrich Weber's resistance may never be definitively proven. The documentation is fragmentary. Witnesses are gone. The chaos of the war's final months destroyed countless records. But here's what we know for certain. The V-2 rocket program, despite being the most technologically advanced weapons system of World War II, was also one of the least effective. More people perished building the rockets than were ended by them. Estimates suggest 20,000 slave laborers lost their lives in production, while approximately 9,000 people were struck by the rockets themselves. Failure rates for V-2 missiles remained persistently high throughout the war. Approximately 25 to 30% of all rockets launched experienced malfunction. Some of these failures were undoubtedly due to the complexity of the technology, the shortage of quality materials, and the reliance on forced labor. But contemporary accounts from Mittelbau-Dora's survivors describe deliberate acts of sabotage by prisoners, components assembled incorrectly when guards weren't watching, wires scratched, fuel contaminated. These tiny resistances were acts of incredible courage, often ending in immediate execution if discovered. And at least some engineers and technicians within the program had doubts. Wernher von Braun himself would later claim he only cooperated to preserve his dream of space exploration. Other scientists made similar claims, impossible to verify, convenient to assert after defeat. The story of Carl Friedrich Weber, whether as described here or in countless variations across the Nazi war machine, represents a profound moral question. How do you resist from inside a totalitarian system? You can't openly rebel. You'll be eliminated before you accomplish anything. You can't simply refuse. You'll be replaced by someone more compliant. So you'll compromise, you cooperate, you survive. And if you are very careful, very clever, and very lucky, you might find small ways to sabotage the machine from within. But you'll pay a price in guilt, in complicity, in the knowledge that your resistance, such as it was, could only ever be incomplete. The prisoners in the camps couldn't choose whether to resist. Their very existence was resistance. The guards and administrators chose to participate fully in atrocity. But the engineers, the scientists, the technical experts occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They had knowledge the regime needed. That gave them a certain protection, a degree of choice that others lacked. What they did with that choice, whether they used it to resist, to profit, or simply to survive, defines their legacy. We celebrate the Norwegian commandos who sabotaged the heavy water production at Vermont, disrupting Nazi atomic research. We honor the French resistance who derailed trains and cut communication. We remember the Warsaw Ghetto fighters who chose to resist with weapons despite knowing they couldn't win. But we often forget the quieter resistances, the calculated incompetence, the deliberate delays, the engineers who made weapons fail. Not because they were heroes, most would have rejected that label, but because they found themselves inside the machinery of horror and chose to throw sand in the gears, even knowing the machine would grind on regardless. In the end, Nazi Germany's wonder weapons did not prevent defeat. The technological marvels of Peenemünde and Mittelbau-Dora came too late, cost too much, and accomplished too little. The V-2 rocket would find its true purpose not in Hitler's vengeance, but in humanity's reach for the stars. Those same engineers, those same calculations would eventually put humans on the moon. The question that remains is this: when you find yourself part of a system of atrocity, what do you do? Carl Friedrich Weber's answer, whether precisely as described or in spirit across countless individuals, was this: you resist however you can. You accept that your resistance will be imperfect, compromised, inadequate, and you live with the consequences for the rest of your life. The underground tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora still exist today, preserved as a memorial. Visitors can walk through the stone galleries where V-2 rockets were assembled, where prisoners suffered and ended, where the most advanced technology of the age was born from the darkest chapter of human history. If you listen carefully in those tunnels, you might hear echoes, not of rockets and machinery, but of the choices people made under impossible circumstances. Choices to cooperate, choices to resist, choices to survive, and the perpetual question, was it enough? This documentary narrative is a dramatized account based on historical research about resistance within Nazi weapons programs, particularly at Mittelbau-Dora. While specific individuals like Carl Friedrich Weber are composite characters, the patterns of sabotage, moral compromise, and resistance described are drawn from documented historical accounts, survivor testimonies, and production records from the V-2 program. The technical details of the V-2 rocket, the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora, and the broader context of Nazi Germany's weapons development are historically accurate.